Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Auditing Ranked Choice Voting Elections. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Karen Brinson Bell. I'm a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team, and I will be your moderator for today's session. First, a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. We have a few handouts for today's session. These are available in the Handouts tab of the control panel. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. To keep this webinar to about 45 minutes, and out of respect for your time, there will only be a brief question and answer session at the end. Questions we are unable to answer or address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website in about a week. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center provides a compilation of best practices and firsthand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this voting method. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policymakers, candidates, and others. The consulting team of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is not advocacy focused. With extensive elections experience and working together overseeing statewide, municipal, and district RCV elections, our team has focused on expanding the resources and information available regarding the administration of and education about this method of voting. We are available to assist in developing implementation plans, processes for tabulating results, voter education, and other matters. Our services are free, including travel. For this webinar, we have the following presenters to help us understand election audits and how to audit ranked choice voting elections. Chris Hughes will lead today's webinar. He's the staff attorney for Fair Vote and serves as a liaison between Fair Vote and the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. His work focuses on the intersection of law and election administration and ensuring that administrators and activists can best understand and collaborate on ranked choice voting. He will be joined by George Gilbert, who served as the Director of Elections for Guilford County, North Carolina, for 25 years and was part of the steering committee that developed materials and tabulation procedures for the statewide RCV contest that was held in North Carolina in 2010. Chris and George have both been active with the Voting Methods Working Group of the EAC's Voluntary Voting Systems Guideline, also known as VVSG, and have collaborated with experts from the Election Verification Network, or EVN. Now, we'll welcome Chris to begin today's presentation on auditing RCV.
Thanks, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Today's topic can get really complex really fast, so I'm going to start us off by setting a baseline. We're talking about post-election audits of ranked choice voting elections at a medium to high level. I'm hoping you'll leave this presentation with more answers than questions, but if I do my job right, you'll be thinking of new questions as we close the presentation out. And just so we're on the same page about what I mean when I say ranked choice voting. For us, ranked choice voting is a form of election where voters rank candidates for a race in order of preference, and votes are counted in rounds. In a single winner election, RCV acts as an instant runoff, determining who has the broadest support in the community. In a multi-winner election, RCV produces a form of proportional representation. You can learn more about RCV at the Resource Center's website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, or FairVote's website, www.fairvote.org. So the first question we have is, what is a post-election audit? Post-election audits are a tool used as a check against errors in our initial conduct of elections. As we all know, no voting system is perfect. Nearly all US elections today are counted using electronic voting systems, and errors can occur in elections due to problems with hardware, software procedures, and even through human error in hand counting of ballots and in the compiling of results. Any of these errors can go undetected if results aren't audited effectively. A post-election audit is the process of hand counting votes on paper records, whether ballots or a tape from a direct recording electronic unit, and comparing those counts to the corresponding vote counts originally reported by the voting system. The benefits of these audits include revealing when recounts are necessary to verify election outcomes, finding error, whether accidental or intentional, countering cybersecurity risks, providing for continuous improvement in the conduct of elections, and promoting public confidence in elections. So that's the basics. Post-election audits are meant to shore up our confidence in the results of our elections and keep our computers and election officials accountable for how they count our elections. According to the National Council of State Legislatures, or NCSL, 32 states and DC require some form of post-election audits. Another 3 have post-election audits under specific circumstances, making for a total of 35 states plus DC running some kind of post-election audit on their machines. The remaining 15 don't have these post-election audits, but may have some procedural audits as part of the post-election process. There are 2 major kinds of audit in use in elections today: conventional audits and risk-limiting audits. Bayesian audits are another form of audit being experimented with, but we'll dive in on those much later in the presentation. So first, conventional audits. Conventional audits are used in all 35 states plus DC that run some kind of post-election audit on their elections. For the 15 states that have no post-election audit in place, implementing conventional audits is a good starting point. Conventional audits can take a lot of different forms, but the basic outline is, first, set a fixed percentage of voting districts or machines used in a given election. Second, randomly select machines or precincts amounting to that number or share of machines and precincts used in the election you're auditing. Compare the paper record of ballots for those machines against the digital record for those same machines. If there are mistakes in the digital record, then you either audit more ballots, or if there's a lot of mistakes, you may end up manually recounting the whole election. If there are no or very few mistakes, then you're done. Congrats on a successful audit. Conventional audits generally cover from 2% to 5% of the machines or precincts in a given election, though states go as low as 1% and as high as 10% for their audits. Even in a landslide election, conventional same number of ballots as they would in a nail-biter election. Many conventional audits aren't designed to confirm the results of an election. This is not a fatal flaw, as they serve many other purposes in election integrity, like those that I reviewed in the last slide. Still, common conventional audits don't have the statistical underpinnings needed to confirm election outcomes. Exceptions include North Carolina's and New Mexico's audits, who have partnered with statisticians to produce more robust forms of audit and to conduct statistical analysis of their audit results in order to provide certification of election results. As with so many things, there's way more going on under the hood with conventional audits than I can convey in this presentation, but this serves as a basic outline for how they work. We'll touch on some examples shortly that will provide additional details for how they work with ranked choice voting. And so the other major form is a risk-limiting audit. In recent years, researchers have developed statistically based audit techniques that cut down on the number of ballots to be audited, while also providing statistical confidence that the election result is correct. A risk-limiting audit doesn't use a fixed percentage of voting districts or machines, but rather determines the number of ballots that need to be audited to confirm the election result using a statistical model. If the race is tighter, more ballots are audited. If the margin's larger, then fewer ballots need to be counted. There are 2 major kinds of risk-limiting audit, or RLA, ballot polling and comparison audits. This presentation is focused only on comparison audits, as they have the most research behind them for ranked choice voting and are the best case scenario for risk-limiting audits. RLAs were widely implemented for the first time in public elections for Colorado's November 2017 elections in 56 of their 64 counties. 8 years were spent developing procedures and tools for Colorado's process and for risk-limiting audits in general. Rhode Island recently adopted a law requiring RLAs, and a number of other states are considering their adoption. Comparison risk-limiting audits require voting systems that generate a cast vote record, that is, a digital file of all the votes on each ballot, which can be matched with the original paper ballot or ballot record. They work by sampling a number of ballots cast in a contest based on the margin of victory in the contest and the risk limit of the audit. The risk limit is the largest chance that the audit is wrong about the election result being reported correctly, essentially what % risk there is that the audit itself failed. Risk-limiting audits start as small as possible, requiring hand counting of only as many ballots as are needed to confirm the reported result of the election. This may, in fact, be only a few dozen ballots out of tens of thousands or even millions, which is a significant advantage over conventional audits. If that initial batch of ballots sampled highlights discrepancies in vote counting, either due to machine mistake or malevolent actor, then more ballots will be sampled in an attempt to satisfy the risk limit of the audit, and so stop the audit. If discrepancies in counting continue to be found, risk-limiting audits can escalate to a full manual recount of the election. If there are no discrepancies, then the audit is completed, and you can rest assured that your election was not compromised within your risk limit. So now that we've gone over the basics of these two forms of audit, let's briefly review to cover their strengths and weaknesses. So conventional audits are widely used now, and there's infrastructure and widespread understanding of them in the elections community. So there's processes and people are generally familiar with them. Risk-limiting audits, on the other hand, are fairly new to elections, and so most people don't fully understand how they operate, and a lot of processes are being refined or developed to improve how they operate. Conventional audits are also relatively easy to understand. It's this pretty blunt instrument of a 1% check or a 2% check of all the machines or precincts in an election, and simple if time-consuming to administer. Like I said, you take this fixed percentage, you hand count those ballots, and you look for errors. Risk-limiting audits, on the other hand, have a complex statistical backing that can make their operation difficult to explain. They also require relatively complex tools to administer, but once those tools are developed, administration is efficient. The tools, if well designed, give clear direction as to which ballots to audit, and typically require auditing of far fewer ballots than a conventional audit. Conventional audits aren't as robust as risk-limiting audits either. They can't be relied upon to confirm the results of an election, even as they have these other benefits to shore up election confidence. And they can be enhanced through collaboration with statisticians who can help design a more rigorous conventional audit method and review the results of that audit to potentially confirm an election result, as is done in North Carolina. And as mentioned, RLAs are designed to confirm the results of an election in addition to all the other benefits of election audits. Finally, conventional audits are mostly neutral to the voting method being audited, making them easy to adapt to new voting methods like ranked choice voting. RLAs, on the other hand, are highly dependent on the voting method being audited because they rely on margin calculations to operate. Different voting methods may need different algorithms for determining the margin that they're trying to test. So what does all this mean for ranked choice voting? Of course, it's complicated. Conventional audits of ranked choice voting elections are already conducted in San Francisco and Minneapolis, following the basic contours of the procedure I described in the last slide. Alameda County, home to Oakland, Berkeley, and San Leandro, who all run ranked choice voting elections, also has a proposed RCV auditing procedure considered to be best practice and recommended by the California Secretary of State, but has not yet used it. A conventional audit was conducted of North Carolina's statewide RCV election in 2010. This audit was designed by statisticians from UNC Chapel Hill and intended to confirm the result of the election. We're going to go over those methods briefly in a bit. They vary somewhat in the details, but follow the general steps we outlined for conventional audits. Risk-limiting audits are, at this time, a bit more difficult to implement for ranked choice voting elections. They're theoretically possible to do for single winner elections, but would take a lot of preparation to pull off. Multi-winner ranked choice voting elections cannot currently be audited using risk-limiting audit methods for reasons we'll address later. And this is where something called a Bayesian audit comes into play. I won't overwhelm you with those details now, but we'll go over them briefly towards the end of this presentation. And now I'll pass it off to George, who will walk us through some existing RCV auditing processes.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good afternoon or good morning, depending upon your location. Appreciate everyone participating with us today. What we're looking for in an audit is, of course, discrepancies. And the discrepancies between perhaps a digital tabulation or a digital record and the system tabulated record and the original paper record. This can take many forms, but generally involves ballots being skipped or misread or ambiguous marks where a human can see something different than the computer has recorded. Minneapolis runs both single winner and multi-winner elections. For their post-election audits, one of each variety of race is selected. 2 random precincts from each race are also selected. then a manual record of the rankings of all ballots cast in these precincts is conducted. For a little background on Minneapolis, they execute their RCV tabulation through a series of sorts of the cast vote record using Excel spreadsheets. These sorts consolidate the various combinations of ranking orders as depicted over on the right-hand side of the screen. The handwritten portion in there is the first three letters of the candidate's last name. They record the first choice, second choice, and third choice for these three candidates and count how many ballots contain that vote pattern. So, before the audit starts, what they do is list all the possible candidate ranking orders of the races being audited. The ballots are then sorted in groups according to their particular ordering of candidates. And these groupings are recorded on a worksheet, such as the one that's shown on the screen. It puts the total number of ballots with each specific combination of rankings. The hand tabulated record is then compared to the digital record and checked for discrepancies. If there are enough discrepancies in an election audit, the audit has to be run again in two different precincts for that election. And this could theoretically become a complete recount of the ballots if there were enough discrepancies in the record. Fortunately, Minneapolis has not encountered that. So if there are few or no discrepancies, the audit is complete. And once again, congratulations. This type of audit will verify the accuracy and integrity of the cast vote record. But since there is no precinct by precinct tabulation record, the accuracy of the tabulation itself is not verified through this process. To compensate for this, Minneapolis makes its cast vote record public, allowing anyone to independently verify the accuracy of its tabulation. And in fact, one of the first things that we at the RCV Resource Center did with our universal RCV tabulator that's under development was tested on the 2013 and 2017 Minneapolis mayoral cast vote records. And we obtained in a matter of seconds the exact same result round by round as the original Minneapolis tabulation. Now let's look at a somewhat different approach in California. California Elections Code requires that all elections in the state that use voting systems be subject to a 1% manual tally. California Secretary of State has optional model guidelines describing how to audit an RCV election in the state based on the procedures that were written for Oakland's RCV election. This audit procedure simulates an RCV election at the precinct level being audited, using the vote totals from the whole election to determine which candidate or candidates are eliminated in each round. So in each round of this simulated RCV election, you compare the results as reported in the original results from that precinct against the results from the manual count, looking for discrepancies. For a paper ballot system such as they have, this involves a relatively simple process of sorting ballots by first choices, comparing these counts to the original precinct report. For each round, the ballot of eliminated candidates are resorted to their next continuing choice, and the results compared to the original report round by round. This round-by-round manual tabulation procedure verifies both the integrity of the cast vote record and of the tabulation software simultaneously. While no cities in California currently use this procedure, as the Dominion system they use does not produce the round-by-round totals by precinct that are required for this type of audit, the California cities also take the additional step of publishing their cast vote records, enabling independent verification as well. Now, in North Carolina, our audit process, which began in 2006 for all elections and continues today, was designed in consultation with a statistician from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The audit design calls for hand counting of ballots from a random sample of precincts, early voting sites, or mail ballots from all 100 counties in the state. This is done for one statewide contest or for the highest contest on the ballot for a non-statewide election. The random selection of precincts takes place the day after the election so that there is no prior knowledge of which precincts will be involved in the audit. For North Carolina's 2010 statewide audit, the RCV contest was chosen by the State Board of Elections as the contest that we were going to audit. This contest involved a judicial race with 13 candidates. 3 rankings were allowed, and the instant runoff was limited to the top 2 finishers in the first choice. This latter feature enabled the contest to be audited in much the same way as a plurality contest. The audit teams were tasked with identifying and counting the highest ranked of the 2 finalists, if any, on each ballot. No additional rounds of counting or candidate elimination were necessary. The audit occurred in 2 parts, first at the local level, then at the state level. Each county audited their local results. I'll describe this process through my own experience in my county in Guilford. Our in-person votes were all cast on DRE machines with voter verifiable paper trails. In addition to each voter's selections being printed on the paper tapes, the system printed a barcode record for each ballot's final selections at the end of each ballot record. As the audit team called out and recorded the vote selections on each ballot record, this barcode was scanned and displayed on a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet display was monitored to ensure the votes being called out matched the votes recorded in the barcode. This practice averted error in the audit on more than one occasion, and it was particularly useful in the RCV contest, where we were not always looking at first choice, but also looking at second and third choices. In the optical scan counties, they performed hand-to-eye counts with the paper ballots and compared the results to the tapes produced by the voting equipment. Once completed, each county then sent a report, such as the one that's on the right-hand side of the screen, which you can't read, to the State Board of Elections. And essentially this compared the hand count results to the official tabulation that had taken place on election night, and it recorded any deficiencies or any differentiation or deviations between those two. The State Board then provided the reports to the professional statistician for a post-audit analysis. I should also mention that the state investigated each of the reported discrepancies they found on the county reports, and they found that many of them to be the result from manual counting errors by county officials. This was universally true of the discrepancies reported for the DRE ballots. The analysis, though, along with the audit design, makes North Carolina's conventional audit rather unconventional. In particular, the post-audit assessment by the statistical group employed techniques that enable them to statistically certify the outcome of the contest being audited. A sample of their methodology and a report is included in the handouts and may be accessed and studied at your leisure for those who are statistically inclined. Now, Chris and I have debated whether or not North Carolina's audit should be called conventional, but since I felt it was, and I thought it was important to include here, both because its methodology can be applied today to RCV elections, and it also demonstrates that so-called conventional audits can be made far more robust than most states have made them thus far. Now that we've gone through these 3 current forms of RCV auditing, I'd like to just summarize some basic ground rules for what we think are good conventional audits. One is definitely to develop the audit procedure in contest and consultation with a professional statistician. This provides a much better means of random selection of precincts. Might also want to consider random selection of races to be audited. And we found it very helpful to have the statistician conduct the post-election audit assessment. Always have multi-person teams with 2 bipartisan or nonpartisan sets of eyes on each part of the process. And if possible, compare the digital record directly to the paper ballots. It depends on the voting system used as to whether that's possible. Also encourage people to use technology to assist the audit. By that, I use the example of what we did in Guilford County of using the scan barcode to improve the accuracy of its hand count. In my experience, hand counting is probably the most difficult, tedious thing to do, and one of the hardest things to do accurately. So anything you can do to improve that is going to help you in the long run. Also, running that hand-counted simulated RCV election at the precinct level using the same candidate elimination as resulted from the full election enables the jurisdictions to audit both the integrity of the cast vote record and the integrity of the tabulation itself. But if you do not have the precinct reports, an important way to verify the tabulation algorithm is to make the cast vote record data public or to tabulate your election using an independent tabulator. The universal RCV tabulator that we're developing will be freely available to any jurisdiction. Using it openly and transparently could go a long way to boost public confidence in election integrity, where publication of cast vote records is not allowed. Now, you may have noticed that most of these recommendations are just standard best auditing practices. There are a few things that are unique to RCV, but there's really not a significant difference in most cases between an RCV audit on a conventional fashion and a normal conventional audit. At this time, I'll turn things back over to Chris to present some of the more complicated audit topics that we're addressing today. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, George. So now that we're in the home stretch, let's talk about the new frontiers in post-election audits, starting with risk-limiting audits. And before I dive in, I wanted to say thanks to Neil McBurnett, who corrected me on a misstatement I made earlier about RLAs. They're not designed to confirm the result of an election. They're designed to test that the result reported isn't wrong, and they provide strong evidence that the outcome was right, but they don't confirm it. And so if I do step up and say confirm the result, please forgive me. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And so with that said, we know that these sorts of audits were used in Colorado in their elections in 2017 for the first time in public elections in a widespread way. And building on this correction that Neil really helpfully gave me, I just wanted to have a brief aside. When it comes to designing an effective audit, the devil really is in the details. This presentation doesn't cover those kinds of details and so may skate over important nuance in how RCV elections need to be audited, especially when it comes to RLAs and Bayesian audits. We're hoping to give a basic framework for how to think about these audits and attempt to lay out what work still needs to be done for RLAs of RCV and not propose an actual RLA audit procedure for RCV because we're certainly not qualified to do that. So before we dive in on ranked choice voting, specifically, I'll briefly review how comparison risk-limiting audits work. They sample a number of ballots cast in a contest based on the margin of victory in the contest and the risk limit. The ballots are then hand counted and compared against the digital record to check for discrepancies between the paper and digital records. If there's a lot of discrepancies, then the audit increases its sample size, potentially up to a full recount, as in any audits. If there are no or few discrepancies, then the audit is completed and you can rest pretty well assured that your election wasn't compromised. Ranked choice voting elections present challenges for risk-limiting audits, although ones that can be addressed in single-winner RCV elections. The biggest hurdle for risk-limiting audits of RCV elections is determining the margin of victory in a given ranked choice voting contest. And why is that? Well, the margin in the final round of counting in an RCV race is not necessarily the closest margin that might have affected the outcome in that contest. One way of saying this is, if there's an earlier round where a candidate was eliminated, and the margin between that candidate who was eliminated and the person with the next highest number of votes in that round is smaller than the margin in the final round, then that earlier round margin could be the actual margin you need to use to run a risk-limiting audit. The actual question being asked to determine that margin is more complicated and harder to answer than that, but that's really the heart of the question, that there isn't an obvious margin just from looking at the results of your election. And this margin can currently be found for single winner ranked choice voting elections using an algorithm produced by a team of computer scientists in Australia, where RCV is used for their federal legislative elections, as well as a number of their state level elections. Multi-winner ranked choice voting elections, also known as the single transferable vote or STV, are used in many international elections, including for Australia's Senate and some American elections. Multi-winner RCV produces a form of proportional representation, but these races also produce more opportunities for narrow margins that affect the margin relevant in risk-limiting audits due to the way votes are counted. There is currently no method for determining exact margins for multi-winner ranked choice voting for risk-limiting audits. Research and experiments are being conducted into how to derive these margins of victory in multi-winner RCV races, so the tools needed to determine margins in these races don't currently exist. It may be, too, that calculating this margin is so complex that a different form of post-election audit will need to be used for multi-winner RCV elections, which I will cover in a couple slides. So now let's briefly cover the state of implementing RLAs for single winner RCV. As stated earlier, risk-limiting audits for ranked choice voting require voting systems that generate a cast vote record, which can be matched with the original paper ballot or ballot record. In addition, the paper records must be really carefully managed so that specific ballots can be easily and accurately retrieved from that paper ballot set. Software to produce the equations for finding single winner RCV margins is available on the GitHub of one of the researchers who developed that algorithm, and the link to that is available at the end of this presentation. This software requires some significant computer expertise to use and would likely require most election jurisdictions to hire outside expert assistance. Once the margin of victory in an RCV race is derived, that margin can then be plugged into the risk-limiting audit formula laid out in conservative statistical post-election audits, link to that paper also available at the end of the presentation, to determine how many ballots must be hand counted to audit that RCV election. Typical RLA procedures are then followed. You randomly select those ballots from the paper ballot record. You check those ballots against the digital record of ballots for discrepancies. Depending on the number of discrepancies, the audit either confirms the result of the election or is run again with a larger sample of ballots. If there's enough discrepancies in those samples, a full manual recount may need to be conducted, as in any audit. Risk-limiting audit formulas that improve the efficiency of audits have been developed for vote-for-one methods of election and are in use in Colorado. Risk-limiting audit formulas have not yet been designed specifically for ranked choice voting elections. This will cause RLAs of RCV to be less efficient by requiring people to audit more ballots than strictly necessary. And while RLAs of single winner ranked choice voting elections can be conducted, they present a number of hurdles primarily due to the expertise required in calculating the margin and determining the number of ballots to be audited. Tools that will improve the efficiency of risk-limiting audits for ranked choice voting elections are in preliminary stages of development now. Additional work remains to be done to get RLAs of ranked choice voting up and running. Further development of RLAs for ranked choice voting should follow a similar path as that followed for RLAs in Colorado, including phased implementation, beginning with pilot programs, specifying the detail of audit procedures in rule rather than in law, and building upon the tools developed in Colorado to lower the barrier of entry. Colorado is the place we highlight here because they have this RLA expertise that they've already built, and there's a local option in the state already for cities to adopt ranked choice voting. So there's 2 cities that use RCV there, and there's other cities considering it now. And before we go, we'll briefly cover Bayesian audits, which I've mentioned a few times. I'll spend just a few minutes explaining what they are and how they might work for ranked choice voting. Bayesian audits rely purely upon random samples of ballots drawn from all ballots cast in an election. Unlike risk-limiting audits, they don't rely on the margin of victory to determine sample sizes when conducting the audit. This enables Bayesian audits to more readily be run on ranked choice voting elections and other non-plurality elections. They're neutral as to the voting method being audited. As with risk-limiting audits, however, the closer the margin of victory, the larger the sample size that may be required to effectively audit the election. Bayesian post-election tabulation audits explained and extended by Professor Ron Rivest of MIT is available as a link at the end of this presentation and is available on his GitHub if you just Google his name. And it explains Bayesian audits in more detail than I'm getting into here, or than I really could effectively. Essentially, Bayesian audits work by sampling a small random set of ballots from the election, hand counting them, and recording the results. The objective is to closely replicate the results of the contest you're auditing. If your initial small batch of ballots doesn't create that result, you increase that sample size until you create this replicate version of the election results. Software-generated variations of this sample data are then used to test the outcome of hundreds or even thousands of slightly modified samples, typically about 1,000 samples that are half the size of the original sample are tested. If the result of 95% of these tests yields the same result as the original election tabulation, those results can be, you can rest pretty confidently that your election wasn't compromised. And obviously this is a really high level description of a complex statistical process, so my apologies to Professor Rivest if I've botched it in any way. And now a caveat. Bayesian audits have not yet been proven to be risk limiting, though it's possible that they can truly be. The procedure laid out above attempts to incorporate risk limits into the process by requiring your tests of the software-generated variations to cross that 95% threshold I mentioned before you stop auditing, but the actual mathematical proof of Bayesian's risk-limiting properties remains to be done. Research is underway to refine and improve the efficiency of Bayesian audits. As with risk-limiting audits of RCV, running a Bayesian audit requires computer science expertise and familiarity with statistical methods. And Bayesian audits aren't the only possible option for multi-winner RCV auditing. A number of ideas are proposed in the paper Auditing Australian Senate Ballots, another link available at the end of this presentation, including variations on RLAs. Lots of experimentation, though, remains to be done on auditing multi-winner ranked choice voting before we'll know exactly how we want to run these more complex forms of audit on them. So what's next? I've got 4 really big next steps for auditing ranked choice voting laid out here. First, build a basic set of best practices for conventional ranked choice voting audits, which we attempted to start building in this presentation with that slide George went over. Then building towards cross-county and statewide ranked choice voting audits, more or less just moving outside of the municipal context, which is where most RCV audits are conducted now, which we've seen a beginning of in North Carolina. A guided implementation process of risk-limiting audits for ranked choice voting, which we really hope will happen in Colorado, and are planning on doing that too. And then finally, greater research into Bayesian audits, risk-limiting audits, and other potential auditing solutions for multi-winner ranked choice voting. And now I'll turn it over to Karen to wrap things up.
Thanks so much, Chris and George, for a great presentation and quite a wealth of information. Today's webinar has been recorded, and we will hold a brief question and answer session in a few moments. The recording and supplemental question and answer document will be the 9th addition to our webinar series archives, which are posted on our website. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We also have launched a podcast called RCV Clips, which is available through iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. And our newest episode is on Santa Fe's first RCV election, is now available for download. So thanks for joining us today, and let's move into the Q&A segment. We'll display some of the sources that were used for this presentation for a few minutes at the beginning of the Q&A for anyone interested in copying those sources down, doing a screenshot, whatever would work. We'll also have those sources available in the Q&A document that we'll be making available in about a week. So with that, I'm going to unmute Chris and George, make sure they're both live, and begin with a set of questions that we've received. We've got about 10 minutes to pick their brains. And so the first question I've got, I think you guys can answer, or we might have to turn over to one of our folks from Colorado at some point, but why did only 56 of Colorado's 64 counties conduct a risk limiting audit?
Chris, you want to take that or you want me?
You go ahead.
Okay, my understanding is that not all of the counties in Colorado had the voting system that enabled them to generate a cast vote record and track it with the paper ballots. They had some of the smaller counties that simply were not able to upgrade their voting system to that technology, and they did not want to wait until everybody in the state could do that, and so they went ahead and began their RLA auditing with the vast majority of the counties who did have the technology to do it.
Okay. I actually have a note from Dwight, and it says all counties that used a voting system conducted an RLA. 6 counties did not have any elections at all. So that's from the person who coordinated the RLAs from Colorado. So thanks for chiming in on that, Dwight.
Yeah, any panelists, any listeners who want to answer these questions for us, please feel free. Many of you know more than we do about this.
Chris, I think this one goes to you. How do jurisdictions determine when they need to escalate an audit?
So that's a good question. I know in Minnesota and California, in Minnesota, they've defined in their statute for their audits, not just ranked choice voting, but they have this formula that they plug the number of discrepancies they've found into, and that determines whether they've found enough discrepancies that they need to audit more ballots. And it's a similar thing in California, though that's defined in regulation instead of in statute. So it makes it a little easier to update and make sure that it follows best practices when you define by regulation as opposed to in law, as is done in Minnesota.
I'm going to shift the next question back to George. And George, you get to draw on your 25 years of election administration experience. This conversation deals with audits of the election results. But obviously, one of our listeners pointed out that there are other things that need to be audited. Can you go over some of the other audit processes that take place in an elections office?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of obviously is a chain of custody audit. Any jurisdiction should have good chain of custody procedures in place and documentation of that, and making sure that that documentation supports the integrity of the election is one of the things that needs to be audited very shortly after the election. You've got a lot of paperwork regarding voter registration. That's something that's one of the first things that's audited, is just making sure that the number of voters that you said voted, matches up with the number of ballots cast. I think those are probably two of the prime examples of the other types of things that need to be audited. Some counties, some states do post-election LNA testing to ensure that their voting equipment after the election is still working exactly the way it was before the election. But those are some examples that I hope are responsive to that question.
I think so, and we can certainly try to expand if need be in our Q&A document.
Yeah, and one thing, LNA stands for logic and accuracy testing, just so everyone knows.
Thank you.
And I'll insert that in most jurisdictions, there's LNA testing, logic and accuracy testing, done on the voting equipment prior to sending it out to the voting locations. So that's another process in place. George, I think that I don't know which one of you will know the answer to this, so I'll let whoever chime in, but I'll start with George and you can pass it off to Chris if need be. What voting system does Minneapolis use, and do they perform the initial tabulation at precincts or polling places, or is that tabulation done centrally?
Well, Minneapolis uses the ES&S voting system with optical scan ballots. Yes, the the votes are tabulated at the polling place. They are the ballots, just as they are in any election, are run through the tabulators. And what this gives them is this gives them a count of all the first choices, all the second choices, and all the third choices. It doesn't relate those second and third choices to the first choice, but it gives you a number. And if one candidate gets more than 50% of the vote on first choices, that candidate is elected. So you may actually have the election results right there, without having to do any sophisticated tabulation. But that system basically generates a cast vote record. And that cast vote record is transmitted or transferred into the election reporting manager, or ERM software, that's part of the ES&S election management system. That system generates in Excel format a copy of the full cast vote record for the election. And it's that cast vote record for the election that is then imported into Excel and that is used for the tabulation by Minneapolis. Now, I will also say the ES&S is currently developing an RCV tabulation module to be added to their system, and that hopefully in the near future, Minneapolis will have access to that too once it is certified.
I think we've got, we're running a little past our 45 minutes, but we really only have one more question and then a more clarification from Dwight Shillman from Colorado on their processes. So the remaining question is just how is the universal tabulator going to be made available, and just briefly discuss again how that could be used as a way to audit.
Well, the universal tabulator is currently available, although it is not complete. It currently has the ability to import and properly configured ES&S cast vote records. And as I said, we have already used it on the data from Minneapolis. We've also used it on test data from Maine. And we do have, there are different rules for tabulation in different jurisdictions. Sometimes if there's an overvote, one jurisdiction will terminate the use of that ballot, and another jurisdiction will skip that overvote and go to the next highest ranked candidate. So we have those features already built into the universal tabulator. I believe, Chris, you have placed that universal tabulator. It's on our website now, and it requires a good bit of computer expertise to use it. But anybody that wants to can go to that website and that GitHub, download the software, and certainly can, test it on any data they've got right now.
Yeah.
Now, how that could be, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the URL is rankchoicevoting.org/universal_RCV_tabulator. And that has links to the GitHub link, which is the source files, and to a Dropbox link that has that all compiled into an installable file. Though you still need to have some facility with manually installing files to use the tabulator.
Yeah. We're working on the graphical user interface right now and hope to have it more user-friendly in the near future. Now, how that can help with auditing elections. As I say, some types of audits, conventional audits, do not actually test the tabulation itself. They test the integrity of the cast vote record. But that doesn't prove that the tabulator did the right things with the cast vote record. However, if you have a voting system that has a tabulation component and you run your election results through that, you can then take that same cast vote record, import it into our universal tabulator, set up the same tabulation rules that are supposed to apply in that local jurisdiction, and run the results and make sure that they match, as we did with the Minneapolis cast vote record. And we got an exact match of the Minneapolis, which basically, in our mind, confirmed the accuracy of the Minneapolis tabulation. That can either be done independently by anyone out there who can run the tabulator, if the cast vote record is made public. If the cast vote record is not made public, which some states actually prohibit, then I would encourage the states themselves to double check their tabulation using independent software, such as the one that we're offering.
Well, we've had a great session today. Certainly appreciate everyone participating. I'm going to read just one last statement from Dwight Shellman trying to clarify the question about Colorado. It says 56 counties used voting systems and conducted RLAs. 6 counties did not have an election at all. 2 counties conducted initial tabulation by hand count, and hence there was no machine tabulation to audit. We'll put that clarification in our written document, and we will also compile answers to all the other questions, and I believe we covered them all today, but if not, we'll certainly add in any questions that you might provide us through the survey or emails post the live webinar. We thank you for joining us today and ask that you stay tuned for announcements about future webinars and also our upcoming online symposium that we'll be doing next month. We hope you have a great rest of your day and will join us for future webinars. Thank you.